In the history of professional wrestling, some performers play a character, and others, well, they become it. They tap into something so raw and real that the line between the show and the person just vanishes. For decades, one man was the master of that terrifying reality. He wasn't a wrestler in the traditional sense. He was a mercenary of mayhem, a monster for hire whose presence alone promised pure chaos. But what happens when that chaos spirals out of control? When a promoter's desperate gamble to save his company unleashes a force that he can't put back in the bottle? This is the story of how a man named Abdullah the Butcher, brought in to spike ticket sales, became the center of a saga of blood, obsession, and consequence that pushed an entire wrestling territory to the absolute edge. Before global entertainment empires, the wrestling business was a patchwork of kingdoms. The map was carved into dozens of territories, each ruled by a local promoter. These were their own little worlds, with their own stars, their own champions, and their own fiercely loyal fans. But like any kingdom, they were vulnerable. When ticket sales dipped, a promoter would often call in a secret weapon, an outsider who could inject instant drama. It was a practice called popping a territory, and there was one man who was an undisputed master of the craft. His name was Lawrence Shreve, but the world would come to know him as Abdullah the Butcher. Born in Windsor, Ontario, Shreve crafted one of the most terrifying and lasting personas in wrestling history, the madman from the Sudan. He didn't look like an athlete. He was a huge, hulking man with a forehead so scarred it looked like a roadmap of his own brutality. His style wasn't about technical skill. It was about pure, raw violence. He was a brawler who used headbutts and his favorite weapon, a common dinner fork, to turn his opponents into bloody messes. Those scars on his head were so deep, as wrestling legend Mick Foley once pointed out, that Abdullah could stick casino chips in them and they'd stay put. This wasn't a gimmick, it was his resume, carved right into his own skin. And promoters paid top dollar for it. They didn't hire Abdullah to win championships or put on wrestling clinics. They hired him for one reason: chaos. He was a special attraction, a walking horror movie. When Abdullah came to town, fans knew they were going to see something that felt dangerously real. They packed arenas, not always to see him win, but to see if their local hero could possibly survive him. That was the business model. And for decades, business was very, very good. In the 1970s, few places on Earth were more passionate about wrestling than Puerto Rico. The island was a hotbed for the sport, with fans who treated its heroes and villains with an incredible level of fervor. At the center of it all was Capital Sports Promotions, which you might know by its later name, the World Wrestling Council, or WWC. Founded in 1973, it was the king of the Caribbean wrestling scene, and every kingdom needs its king. In Puerto Rico, that king was Carlos Colon. Colon was more than the promotion's top star. He was a part owner and the living symbol of Puerto Rican pride. He was the ultimate hero, the man who defended the island's honor against all challengers. The audience adored him. They saw him as one of their own, so his victories were their victories. But for a hero to be a hero, he needs a monster to fight. And by the late 1970s, Colon and the other bookers at WWC decided they needed the most terrifying monster they could find. So, in 1978, they made the call. They brought in Abdullah the Butcher. It was a calculated risk. Abdullah's reputation for leaving a trail of blood and chaos was well known, but WWC was betting that the clash between their beloved hero and this unstoppable destructive force would be box office gold. They were right. From the moment Abdullah set foot on the island, the territory wasn't just popped, it was set on fire. It wasn't just a match, it was the start of a war. The rivalry between Carlos Colon and Abdullah the Butcher wasn't your typical wrestling feud. It wasn't a quick program designed to sell tickets for a few months. It became this sprawling, on-again, off-again epic of violence that would define an entire era of Puerto Rican wrestling. It was a money-making machine built on a foundation of pure hatred. Abdullah's impact was instant. He wasn't just another bad guy. He was a primal threat to everything the fans held dear. His matches with Colón felt less like athletic contests and more like fights for survival. The chemistry was perfect. The noble, resilient hero against the sadistic, unstoppable monster. The dynamic was so successful that the territory's top prize, the WWC Puerto Rican Heavyweight Championship, became a hot potato between them. And when WWC created its new Universal Heavyweight Championship in 1982, the feud continued over that title as well. These frequent title changes kept the rivalry at a fever pitch. Every time they stepped into the ring, the stakes felt monumental. The matches themselves were just brutal. Abdullah's fork was a constant, terrifying presence. The sight of him carving up Colón's forehead, drawing blood in front of thousands of horrified but captivated fans, became an iconic, gruesome image of the feud. Colón himself once famously said, "80% of the blood I've shed in the ring, I've shed because of Abdullah." It speaks to the brutal reality of their battles. Both men would carry the physical scars of this feud for the rest of their lives. As the years went by, the storylines had to get more and more extreme to keep the shock value. In 1982, an angle where Abdullah attacked Colón led to a brutal barbed wire match. The feud started pulling in other wrestlers and demanded increasingly dangerous stipulations. Perhaps the most infamous angle happened in 1986. During a TV segment, Abdullah allegedly threw ammonia in Carlos Colón's eyes. The promotion sold it as a genuine, career-threatening attack. For weeks, WWC television showed Colón in a hospital bed with his eyes bandaged, while doctors gave grim updates. The storyline was that he'd been blinded, forcing him to give up a championship. Now, this was a staged part of the narrative, but it was presented with such chilling realism that it completely blurred the lines for the audience. It wasn't just about winning anymore. The story was that this monster, Abdullah, had tried to rob their hero of his sight. The desire for revenge was off the charts, and it led to record-breaking attendance for their next match. The rivalry had become the promotion's greatest asset, but it was also a dangerous addiction. The need to constantly top the last atrocity was creating an environment where the illusion of danger and the reality of it were becoming harder and harder to tell apart. The feud between Carlos Colón and Abdullah the Butcher had become the lifeblood of Puerto Rican wrestling. But the formula of escalating violence was pushing the boundaries of what was safe and what was believable. That dynamic was about to have consequences that would send shockwaves through the entire industry. Before we get to the fallout, if you're enjoying this look into wrestling's darker corners, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming up. So, the title of this story, The Night Abdullah the Butcher Almost Killed a Territory, isn't about one single moment. It's about something more corrosive. It's about a promotion spending years dancing on a razor's edge. The night was every night Abdullah and Colón stepped into the ring. And the thing being almost killed was the delicate trust between the performers and the audience that allows wrestling to even exist. Just imagine the scene. A packed stadium in Puerto Rico, the air thick with heat and the roar of thousands of fans. In the ring is Carlos Colón, the island's hero, often already bleeding. And then the crowd parts as Abdullah the Butcher lumbers to the ring, eyes wide, radiating pure menace. There's no fancy entrance music, no pyro, just him, the fork, and the promise of violence. Their matches were a symphony of brutality. Chairs, chains, and that fork were all instruments in an orchestra of pain. They brawled into the stands, turning the whole arena into a riotous battleground. This was the atmosphere WWC had built. They sold chaos, and Abdullah was their most reliable supplier. The near-death element, like the ammonia blinding angle, was a storytelling device, but one that played with real fire. In an era before strict medical oversight, a real injury was always just one slip-up away. The constant blading, the intentional cutting to draw blood, carried health risks that weren't fully understood at the time. The pressure to keep the feud white-hot meant the violence just had to keep escalating. A punch wasn't enough. A chair shot became normal. Soon, only the most shocking acts could satisfy an audience that had been conditioned to expect pure brutality. This is how a territory gets pushed to the brink, not by one big disaster, but by 1,000 small cuts. It's when a promotion becomes so dependent on a single, dangerous formula that it can't pull back. The line between a staged injury and a real one gets dangerously thin. The territory wasn't on trial in a courtroom because of this feud. It was on trial in the court of risk and consequence. And sooner or later, that bill always comes due. The business impact of the Colon-Abdullah feud was massive. It drew huge crowds and made a ton of money for years. But it also created a dangerous dependency. After watching years of barbed wire matches and fork stabbings, how do you get an audience excited about a simple wrestling hold? The feud had set a precedent for violence that was almost impossible for any other storyline to match. The cultural impact was even deeper. The hyper-violent, reality-blurring style that made Puerto Rico famous also nurtured an environment of extreme intensity, both in the ring and behind the curtain. This tense atmosphere is the grim backdrop for one of the darkest days in wrestling history. On July 16, 1988, another legendary brawler, Bruiser Brody, was fatally stabbed in a locker room shower before a WWWC show. The man accused, fellow wrestler Jose Gonzalez, also known as Invader 1, would later be acquitted after claiming self-defense. To be crystal clear, Abdullah the Butcher was not involved in this horrific event. Bruiser Brody's death was a separate, awful tragedy. However, it can't be completely separated from the environment of the time. Wrestling historians often see it as the moment the simulated violence of the Puerto Rican scene was tragically eclipsed by real-world fatal violence, shattering the illusion and leaving a permanent stain on the territory. And the consequences of a career built on blood weren't just limited to the territories. They followed Abdullah himself for decades, leading to a legal battle that would expose the real-world dangers of his gimmick. Enter Devin Nicholson, a Canadian wrestler known as Hannibal. Nicholson idolized Abdullah and booked the aging legend for a match in 2007. During the match, both men bled. Nicholson later alleged that Abdullah cut him with a razor blade without his consent. In 2009, Nicholson was on the verge of signing a WWE contract, a lifelong dream. But that dream was shattered when a medical screening revealed he had hepatitis C. Believing he contracted the disease from Abdullah in their 2007 match, Nicholson filed a lawsuit. The case was explosive. Nicholson's legal team presented evidence arguing that he and Abdullah carried the same rare genotype of the virus, suggesting it was proof of transmission. Abdullah, for his part, denied he had the disease. In 2014, an Ontario court ruled in Nicholson's favor, finding Abdullah liable for negligence and assault. Nicholson was awarded $2.3 million in damages. The verdict was a stunning, real-world epilogue to a career spent blurring the lines. The blood that had been Abdullah's greatest selling point, the thing that popped territories and made him a legend, had led to a devastating, real-world consequence, validated by a court of law. Abdullah the Butcher's legacy is complicated. He was, without a doubt, a master of his craft. He was a once-in-a-generation attraction who understood the psychology of fear better than almost anyone in the history of the business. He traveled the world and made promoters rich by delivering exactly what he promised, a spectacle of blood and mayhem that felt terrifyingly real. His feud with Carlos Colon in Puerto Rico is a monument to that success. It was a business engine that powered a promotion for the better part of 2 decades. It turned WWC into a powerhouse in the wrestling world and created memories that fans on the island will never forget. But it's also a profound cautionary tale. It's a story about the cost of violence-driven entertainment. The feud showed how a promotion could build an empire on simulated brutality, but it also showed how that same brutality could create a dangerous and unsustainable environment. The constant need to escalate the violence blurred the lines between performance and reality for everyone involved. The territory of Puerto Rico wasn't almost killed in a single night. It was pushed to the brink over many years by its reliance on a formula of chaos that it ultimately couldn't control. The real trial wasn't a hypothetical one for the promotion. It was the literal court case that exposed the hidden dangers of Abdullah's bloody gimmick, and it was the real-world tragedy of Bruiser Brody's death, which cast a dark shadow over the entire era. Abdullah the Butcher was paid to be a monster, and he played that role to perfection. But in an industry built on illusion, his most lasting legacy might be the uncomfortable truth he exposed. When you sell chaos for a living, you don't always get to control the final price. The blood, which for so long was the source of his fame, ultimately became the source of his infamy. So, was Abdullah the Butcher a brilliant performer who gave the audience what it wanted, or a dangerous liability who took things too far? The answer, like the man himself, is complex. What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And for more stories from the strange and fascinating world of professional wrestling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe.